Hello, everybody. Andrew Blake from the digitalaudiomanual.com with another episode of Cubase Tips for the week of July 18th, 2025. Today, let's talk about Groove Agent and specifically some of its quirks. And by that, I mean behaviors that will kind of stop you in your tracks as you move through using Groove Agent. Just doing typical things, you'll find yourself saying, what is wrong with this? And why is it behaving this way? So we're going to start off by clearing up a few of those kind of things. So the first thing on the quirky list, we have a Groove Agent in front of us. And these things should apply to both Groove Agent SE and the full Groove Agent. But you find a kit and you find a pattern that you really like. In this case, I have the kit SE opened up and I have the preset of no gain, no pain. And I come over to the pattern, the second one from the top, and I click on it. And I hear that it has a really nice kind of swing sound, and I know I can use that in a song. And most of you have learned by now that you can actually take these patterns from Groove Agent and drag them right up into your project. Just another way to use the patterns. You can change their order easy that way, build out arrangements. There's a lot of advantages to bringing them up into the project. But if I take this pattern, drag it up into the project, and then play it in my project, I can hear that it's been changed, which right away is going to throw you off because you're expecting to hear a pattern like this. And when we bring it into the project, it sounds like this. Almost like it's developed a slight limp in its transition. When this first happened to me, I thought that maybe Cubase was re-quantizing the pattern. It's obvious that the snare drum is hitting in a funny way, kind of doubling up. So I went down to where it says auto quantize in my project, and I turned that off to see if that would solve our problem. If I remove the pattern, then re-drag it up again, and then try to play it in the project, still has that kind of glitch sound, and something has definitely been altered on the transition from the Groove Agent pad up into the project window. So it turns out the answer to this problem is on this tiny little button down here in the lower left. If you hover over it, it says use the pattern MIDI port for pattern pads. When this is off and I play the pattern, then it has that funny snare sound. If I turn it on while the pattern is playing, then it immediately corrects itself and sounds like the original pattern exactly. The reason this made it onto the quirky list is because it's highly unusual that any new user to Groove Agent is going to have any clue what this button is or that it's even here on the interface. In fact, typically, one would have to have some serious time invested into Groove Agent and be well along the way to understanding many of the inner workings before this button would even become apparent in the first place. So let's have a look at this and what it does. Along with all the other features that are available in Groove Agent, one of the main things the program does is it divides itself into a pattern player and an instrument player. The instruments are basically individual samples, all kinds of different sounds. Some of these samples can even be layered on top of each other. And the patterns are kind of combinations of those grouped together into a pattern. Both the pattern and the instrument uses pads to trigger the different sounds. Again, this is slightly different from the full version of Groove Agent, but the idea is the same. When you hit patterns, you have a series of pads you can hit that will trigger the patterns. And when you hit this instrument tab, you have a series of pads you can hit that trigger individual instruments or samples. You look up on the interface itself, in the middle area, there's a button that turns on a keyboard. And on this keyboard, you get a visual breakdown of where the patterns are and where the instruments are. You can see over here on these tan-colored keys that these are going to trigger the patterns because they are the same color as these actual pattern pads here. If you move up into these white keys, then these are going to trigger the individual samples when you hit them. You'll notice right now when our little port button is turned off, that when I hit the pattern tab, this keyboard looks a certain way. Then when I switch to this instrument tab, this keyboard continues to look exactly the same. That's because this keyboard is trying to play everything it can, whether it's patterns or individual instruments. It's trying to keep everything on one keyboard for you to play. That's convenient, but a kind of hidden problem occurs because many of these instrument pads are also overlapped by many of these pattern pads. In other words, all the instrument or samples are laid out on this keyboard, and all the patterns are laid out on this keyboard. But because they're all on the same keyboard, if you look at this pattern right here, it says C0, and that stands for this pad right here. That also says in the upper right, C0. That's the name of this key right here on the keyboard. When we switch over to the instrument, C0 is right here. Now, right now, there's no sample on it, no big deal. But if there was a sample on this pad, we wouldn't be able to play it because the pattern is also occupying this C0 key. When our port button is turned off, the patterns are kind of given a higher priority. If they occupy a key that is also occupied by some instrument or sample, the only thing you're ever going to hear is the pattern. Like we said a minute ago, when we hit the pattern tab, the keyboard looks one way, and when we hit the instrument tab, the keyboard continues to look the same way. When we enact our port button, that behavior changes. Now the pattern keyboard kind of looks the same way. In other words, it still has the patterns. All the instrument keys have now been turned off, and if I click on them, they have no response. If I switch over to the instrument tab, now all the samples are here, but there's no longer any pattern pads. So each tab has now been given its own dedicated keyboard that can only play either patterns or the instruments. So overlapping is no longer an issue because they're now on their own independent, basically virtual keyboard. It's also worthy to note that this port button is only visible when you're on the pattern tab. When you switch to the instrument tab, it's no longer here. I'm going to leave this on for a second. Let's take Groove Agent off the screen. We go up to our pattern and open it up. These notes down here on the bottom are designated as A#0, and if I click on them, they trigger a hi-hat sound. In fact, if we mute everything and only unmute the hi-hats, it's very obvious. Whereas, come back over to the Groove Agent interface and turn off our little port button, everything is overlapping again. That same key that a second ago was hitting a hi-hat, now when I click on it, it's triggering some kind of pattern. If I bring Groove Agent back into view, I can see one of these blue keys has A#0 in the upper right. If I click on one of these notes, you can see that it's triggering that pattern. And that's why we get a funny sound when we try to play this pattern. Some of these notes are being triggered their normal way, the kick drum, or the snare drum. There's no conflicts on the keyboard. But when it tries to play this hi-hat sound, it can only play the pattern because, again, the patterns get the highest priority. And the hi-hat note that was on there no longer being allowed to play. That's the beginning and end, why this button makes a big difference, and how the patterns change when we actually bring them up into the project view. Just one final note on this before we move on. These patterns did not get quantized like I was thinking about in the beginning when I changed the quantized value. In fact, these patterns are exactly the same as they were when they were dragged in, but the only difference is the notes they're actually triggering and the notes that they trigger, or rather the notes that they're allowed to trigger, depend on whether this button is turned on or off. I hope that helps bring a little bit of clarity in case you encounter this issue at some point in your productions. And then on to the last entry on my little quirk list. And I'm sure there's a few of you probably have your own lists of various quirks. Feel free to leave them in the comments. I'd be curious to see some of your moments of why does it behave that way. But this last one I'm going to show you pertains to how we use samples with Groove Agent. This not only is a quirk for me, but again, it's kind of one of those me letting the cat out of the bag or spilling the beans, or basically just telling you secrets again. Because with this one, I was told the option is not possible, and yet I stumbled on a way where the option is possible. Let me explain a little bit further here. I've been using Cubase for quite a while, and it was back when Groove Agent kind of was just coming out. That time I was making a lot of songs where maybe I would go and get a sample from the media bay, and I would drag it right out into the project. Then I would drop these samples into my song and play them, and this was a real common way for me to produce at this time. So when Groove Agent first appeared, I was really liking the internal sounds that I was given. And I liked using it the conventional way that it's set up to use. But I also found myself wanting to just find particular samples. For example, I hear interesting sounds, and I'd want to just bring those out as samples into my project and drop them basically the same way I did this one. Not necessarily using Groove Agent as a drum machine, but just using the samples however I wanted throughout my production. And yet, no matter how I searched, I wasn't able to find any way to actually take a sample from Groove Agent and bring it into my project. Now, Groove Agent is pretty amazing as a one-way street in terms of bringing things into Groove Agent. You can drag samples from the media bay, or you can bring them in from your project. Really, so many other ways. The drag and drop options in Groove Agent, there's really a lot of choices. You can drag samples onto pads. You can rearrange pads by dragging them. But there was no way that I could find to simply find a sample in the browser or anyplace else in Groove Agent and just drag it out into the project. I could play it, I could render it in place, I could do all those kind of typical operations, but there was no simple way to just bring something out of Groove Agent as a sample. So again, I began searching the forums and asking the various experts, and I was basically told that that option just doesn't exist. And in fact, I was given a reason one time that it was basically due to copyright. In other words, Steinberg has to protect their samples and not make it too easy for us to use them, which I thought was kind of a peculiar answer given for why I couldn't do it. But I accepted it and just went on with things, and then continued to learn about Groove Agent and how it operates. And I came to the point where I was experimenting with these kinds of things. Let me show you. Again, when you switch over to the Instrument tab, every time you click on a pad, whatever sample is assigned to that pad shows up over here in this window. And right above it, it actually shows the sample. And if it's some kind of factory sample, then it's just looking at where it came from in the original factory catalog. But you can take other samples. For example, let me grab this snare. And you can drag it up into this area where this first sample is, and a little red border will either go around this sample, or you can go to the front of it or the end of it, and you'll see that border show up as an end or a beginning point, and then drop your sample. And now you have both of those samples up in the window. And play these samples as layers, or you can have them change with velocity. But again, they're assigned to this pad. If you're on this main tab in the upper left, right below the samples, there's a drop down that says Mode. You can switch it from velocity. I'm going to switch it to layer. And that means when I hit this, both of these samples are being heard. You can go further and change their volume, all kinds of things. But the idea is that you have two samples up here now playing on this one pad. Let's add one more. I'm going to go over here to the media bay. I'll hit this clap sound, bring that up to the window, put it on the end and drop it. And now I have three different samples up here, all assigned to this pad. Of course, you can make some great sounds by layering up your samples in general. And then one night, just by experimentation, not really knowing what I was doing at the time, may have been trying to rearrange these samples, change their order, which you can by just clicking and dragging them. As I grabbed one of these, somehow or another, I accidentally wound up going over the actual project window. And if you'll notice, my mouse icon has now changed to something that looks like I can drop here. And if I let go of this, look what it did. It actually brought that sample out and dropped it in my project. So just like that, you can indeed bring any sample out of Groove Agent into your project. You simply have to go to the Instrument tab, locate your sample, whether it's a multi-sample or a single one on any of these pads. Simply click on it, drag it right into your project, and then you have total access to all the samples that are available in Groove Agent. These kind of things are not really written down anywhere, seem to be hidden in the secret vault of knowledge that nobody ever tells you about. But I was surprised when I found that, and now I've decided to share it with you. I hope that serves you in some way, and you can have some fun now that you know the trick. And that's where we're going to end it for today. I hope you enjoyed as I went through some of my little glitches and show you how I've worked them out. Ultimately, they all turn out really not to be glitches, but more like secret doors into hidden features. And once you know the secret doors and how to get through them, it allows you to take command and really make use of what's there in Groove Agent in the first place. So take those tips and have fun with them. Go make some great music as always, and then I'll see you next time. All right, it's going to wrap it up for today. As always, if you haven't already, click the link in the description of this video to learn how you can get access to the all-new Digital Audio Manual Preferred. It's the clear, step-by-step solution showing you not only the tips, but all the secret and typically never talked about features that'll take you to a higher level of using your software. If you've been searching for an all-in-one solution to take you from start to finish and learning Cubase, Wavelab, and other music software, this is exactly what you've been looking for. So click on the link in the description and come and be part of the clear path to a better learning experience. So today we took a look at some of the quirks of Groove Agent. In particular, we talked about how patterns can change when you drag them from the pads right up into the project, how that behavior can be controlled by the port button, what that little port button is, kind of behaviors it controls, and then I shared with you my discovery about how you can bring samples right out of Groove Agent directly and drop them into your project. And we will continue to explore all these different features and functions and all the creative tools that are available to us. As always, it's great to have you guys here, and I'll see you on the next video.